is Rosemary Hayes, and I've been writing for children for over 30 years. So when I was talking today about these two books, I read the introduction to the first one, just the introduction to the children, and then I asked them various questions. Who did they think the people in the introduction were? Where did they think the story was set? Was it in the past or the present? Was it in our world or was it in another world? And what did you, there was a call for help that came in the introduction. What did they think this call for help was, and who did it come from? There were no right answers, but I then set them a task, and this was year 5, to write a little outline, and I showed them how to work out an outline, a narrative arc, of where the story might be set, who the main characters were, what their problem was to overcome, why they had to, what motivation was it for them to overcome this problem. Then a lot of rising of tension, coming up to the climax of the story, and then the resolution. So all they had to do was to write out a plot, not do any, and not filling in the gaps. And they did some really interesting plot lines, which are quite different from what I had imagined, but no, nonetheless valid. So that was, and they also did some drawings as well for that. Just to introduce myself, my name's Rosemary Hayes, and mostly I write for older children. I mostly write for what we call young adults, but I have done a few books for your age group, and these are the ones that we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to crack on because we've got quite a lot of work to get through. So, year 5 are going to be working on one of my books called The Stonekeeper's Child, which is a 2-volume book, 2-volume set. Are any of you familiar with something called the narrative arc? Anyone heard of that? It's a bit of a fancy name, but what it means is how we put a story together. So where do you think we begin a story? Anyone got any ideas? Where would we begin? Do you think we need the place? What sort of place might we have? Any old place? School? Anything? Yeah? Sorry? A house, could be at home, could be at school, could be out in the forest, could be anywhere. Yeah.
Could it be in the football stadium?
It could be in the football stadium, could be anywhere. So we start a story usually with a place. So this is where we call that setting. Then what do we do when we get on writing our story about the plots of our story? Who have we got to introduce? Anyone got any ideas? Yeah. Yes, a character, the main character or characters. Could be anybody. These stories are going to be yours, not mine. So, main character. Now, what do you think? We've got to have a story, so there's got to be a bit of a problem to overcome, hasn't there? So shall we put that problem? And our characters need to overcome that problem, but they've got to have a reason for overcoming that problem. And that's what we call motivation. So we'll put the motivation here. So what do you think might happen next? Where do you think we go from beginning of the story is the place, then the main characters, Then a problem to overcome, and we've got to make sure that these characters have a reason for overcoming that problem. They've got to maybe rescue somebody or find something, whatever it happens to be. They've got to have a good reason for overcoming it. And then you've got to make a story exciting. What else do you think you've got to have in your story? You don't want it all to be just the same, do you? You don't want it to be what we call bland. Do you think we've got to have a bit of excitement? Yeah? What would you call that? Yeah?
Conclusion?
No, that comes much later. But it's quite right, we do get to a conclusion. But we've got to have some danger. We've got to what we call jeopardy, which is really danger, really. So, this isn't writing very well. So you've got your place, your setting, you've introduced your characters, you've given them a problem to overcome and a reason they want to overcome that problem, and then you introduce some danger. So are they going to get the baddies? Are they going to get captured? So there's got to be some tension in the story. So then, what comes next, do you think? You've got to have, as I said, lots of tension. Will they get caught? Will they rescue somebody? Will they be in danger? Will the tunnel collapse that they're going through? Something like that. And then you've got to have, what's the absolute focal point of the story? What's the main thing of the story? Do you know the name for that? Do you know what that is? Yeah?
Is it a climax?
Yes, climax or crisis. Absolutely right. Well done. Who knows what a crisis is? You know what a crisis is? Yeah?
Like when it all goes wrong or something?
Like when everything comes together and you wonder if it's ever going to resolve, and you're nearly, your hero or heroine is nearly caught but not quite, and the baddies nearly get away but not quite. So you've got all this tension and drama, and you come to a crisis, and then we come to the, you mentioned it just now, it was you who mentioned it. The resolution. So that's really the shape, what we call the shape of the story, the plot. Place, character, problem to overcome, reason for your characters overcoming the problem, danger, tension, a crisis. You reach that crisis point, and then you tie up all the loose ends. So I'm going to give each of you a sheet with this on to help you when you do your story. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to read you two excerpts, the beginning of two of my books. Firstly, I'm going to read out from the Stonekeeper's Child, which is Year 5's book that you're going to work on. And I will give you this excerpt in your group, but please listen now, and we're going to have some questions. And this story came about when I was on holiday on a Scottish island. And I heard all sorts of stories of myths and legends about the islands around the place that I was staying. And they sort of lodged themselves in my head, and I thought, I have to write about this. Sometime I'll have to write about this. So a couple of years later, that's what I did. So this is the beginning of the Stonekeeper's Child. The trees were sparse on the island, growing only in a few hollows where the cattle gathered to get some relief from the weather. They were canny, the fairy cattle, finding a barn wall here, the side of a house there, sometimes even venturing onto the lee shore of the island to seek shelter from the storm. The cliffs at their backs, as they picked their way through the gritty sand, the rocks, and the great heaps of seaweed. They'd been bred on the island and they knew all its ways. They knew when to hunker down to produce warmth in the worst of the winter gales, the older, bigger steers on the outside, protecting the young ones. They understood the island's climate. The days which could fool you, starting out with calm, bright skies in the morning, which later turned into a tumble of dark clouds, spilling out freezing rain blown in from the sea. So it was the cattle that heard it first. But Drake knew what it meant, and for a moment he stood still, too shocked to move, listening intently, hoping he'd been wrong. But when the sound came again, he ran to the stable, vaulted onto the back of his pony, and galloped towards Tana's house at the other end of the island. He and Tana were the last surviving members of the two ruling families on the island, and they'd only just grown to adulthood. As he approached, he saw her in the distance, running towards him, her loose auburn hair flying behind her as she jumped across the tufts of salty grass, stumbling in her haste. Her eyes were wild as she fought for breath and pulled away from him. "Did you hear it?" she gasped. He didn't reply. "Did you hear it?" she repeated, shouting at him now, stamping her foot. He nodded slowly and leant against the pony's heaving flank. Tana's eyes locked with hers. "Why now, Drake? Why on our watch? What does it mean?" But her words were lost as the sound came again, louder this time, carried on the wind. A low, insistent, keening sound, an unmistakable call to tell. So that's the story that you're going to continue, year 5, and we'll just talk a little bit about some questions. So where do you think that story is set? Yeah?
No.
It's on an island. Where do you think it's set? Yeah. What sort of island? Yes.
Scotland.
It could be in Scotland. It's that sort of climate. Yes, that's right. And when do you think it's set? Do you think it's set now? You think it's in our world, right? There are no wrong answers or right answers to this at all. I just want to see what you think about that piece of writing. Who do you think Drake and Tana are? Who do you think they might be? There was a bit of a clue, wasn't there, in that first introduction here? They were the rulers. They'd just become the rulers of the island. Right, yes, but they were very young. So that's who Drake and Tana are. Now, this is a much more difficult question. Who do you think might be asking for their help? Yeah?
Somebody who got shipwrecked.
Somebody who
Was shipwrecked.
was shipwrecked. Yes, not in the story, but it's an idea, certainly. Anyone else got any ideas of who might be asking for their help? Yeah? This is what I want you to write about, year 5. I want you to answer these questions. There's no right answers at all. And what do you think is going to happen? Any ideas what might happen next in this story? So, what I'm going to do is to hand out these. This is just to remind you about the story line, about what we were talking about. The story arc here. So you've all got one of these. always wanted to write stories, and I wrote my first book when I was 10, and I sent it off to a publisher and waited and waited and waited. And I remember I wrote it in pencil on biology file paper. And eventually the publisher wrote back a very nice letter and said, "Well done, but I'm afraid it's not quite for us." And I was so enraged that I threw the whole lot on the fire, and I wish very much I'd kept it, because I'm sure it was completely dreadful. So it goes back a long way, this yearning to write. Later in the jobs that I did, I wrote copy and publicity for an ad agency, and working for publishers. The first book that I had published, I put the manuscript in for something called the Kathleen Fiddler Award, which was it was a national award for new writers in the 8 to 12 age group. And I won it jointly, so that really started me off. And that was this book called Race Against Time, which was a spooky sort of time slip story about somebody coming back from the past, and a lot of chases going about. And it was actually based in Australia, which is where I used to live. And Penguin published that, and then I had a long and very happy relationship with Penguin for some years, publishing lots of other books. And then I worked for Francis Lincoln, and I did quite a few books for them. This was one that I did for middle grade children, called Loose Connections, about a little boy who's under rather odd circumstances is left with his grandmother, and who is visited by someone from her past who turns out to be not quite as she seems. And it's a struggle of a young boy coming to terms with his beloved grandmother she's losing her mind a bit. But it's actually very joyful as well, and there's a lot of uplifting in it, and that was one of the ones that also won a prize. And I've written lots of historical novels, Shipwrecks, Forgotten Footprints, and The Blue-Eyed Aborigine, and also about young Muslims in England, Payback and Mixing It are both stories about young Muslims and how they feel about living in Britain at the time. And I did a lot of research and worked with a group of young Muslim girls who were in Cambridge and helped me with the manuscript and read it for me and commented. And that was quite challenging, and I felt because I wasn't of their faith, I had to be really careful about making sure I got everything right, and I hope I did. More recently, and these are the books that I was talking about to the school today, these two books, it's a 2-volume set called The Stonekeeper's Child. The first one's called The Call, the second is called Kalen's Revenge. And these are set on a mythical island, loosely based on an island off the coast of Scotland. And I heard this wonderful story when I was in Scotland once about this island that is only ever glimpsed very, very rarely, and it's usually under a complete cloud of mist, so no one can see it. And there was this legend that a fisherman one day, the mist rose and he saw the island, and he managed to get there, and he saw this beautiful fairy girl, fell in love with her and didn't leave. And anyway, the story didn't end very well. And that really lodged in my mind. And so I thought I would write about this island and the folk that live there, who are fairy folk, and about a young child who's half fairy, half human, and her adventures, but she has also got some power that she doesn't realise, but some of the elders in the island do. And there's a lot of battles, there's a lot of travels, there's a lot of fairy creatures, particularly a shape-shifting kelpie who's quite unreliable, and all sorts of other things. So it was quite a sort of feat of the imagination and a flight of fancy, this one. When I was writing this, I worked with some children in year 7 at the secondary school where I'm patron of reading, and they read the manuscript for me and they gave me some really useful comments. And it's really useful and helpful to have feedback from the right age group. And one of them made a lovely drawing for me of which you'll probably see here, and she's called it the halfling because the child, the main protagonist in the story, is half human, half fairy, and has to go and rescue some scrolls from the underworld, and it's all very exciting. There's a lot of chasing going on.